Let's take a look at the reactions of some innocent convicts who were let loose from the grip of injustice and set free. Calvin Michael Smith. Calvin Michael Smith's case is very disturbing. He was found guilty of a violent attack and robbery in North Carolina in 1997 when he was just 20. However, he always maintained his innocence. Despite the lack of evidence, the prosecution convinced the court to convict him. The judge sentenced him to almost 30 years in prison despite very little physical proof that he committed the crime. Thankfully, after spending more than 20 years in prison, new evidence emerged in 2019 that proved Smith's innocence. He was declared not guilty and released. The Central Park Five. The Central Park Five, also known as the Exonerated Five, were 5 young Black and Latino men wrongly found guilty of raping a white woman in New York City's Central Park in 1989. The victim was seriously hurt and left unconscious, and the attack received much attention from the media. The police arrested and charged 5 teenage boys: Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise with the crime. The boys were interrogated for a long time without their parents or lawyers present, and the police used forceful methods to make them confess. All 5 boys were found guilty and sent to prison, with Corey Wise receiving the longest sentence of 13 years in an adult prison. In 2002, a convict rapist named Matias Reyes confessed to the crime. DNA evidence confirmed that Reyes was the only one responsible for the assault, and none of the Central Park Five were involved. The 5 men were declared innocent in 2002 and their convictions were overturned. Eddie Lowry. The story of Eddie Lowry is a heartbreaking example of how the justice system can fail innocent people. In 1981, he was convicted of rape in Kansas. He received a sentence of 11 years in prison. The court's response to Lowry's case was shocking. The prosecution secured a conviction despite a lack of evidence connecting him to the crime. The judge imposed an incredibly long sentence, even considering Lowry's young age and the questionable evidence against him. When Lowry was convicted, he was shocked and couldn't believe it. Being a teenager, he didn't know how to defend himself against the accusations. He spent nearly 10 years in prison, maintaining his innocence throughout. Thankfully, in 2022, Lowry was pardoned and released. New DNA evidence emerged that proved he had no involvement in the crime. Markie Tankleff. The case of Markie Tankleff is a disturbing example of how innocent individuals can be wrongly accused and convicted. In 1990, when he was 17 years old, Tankleff was accused of killing his parents in their home on Long Island. He was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years despite maintaining his innocence. The court's response to Tankleff's case was deeply troubling. There was a lack of physical evidence and several inconsistencies in the prosecution's arguments, yet the jury still declared him guilty. The judge imposed an incredibly long sentence, which would have kept Tankleff behind bars for most of his life. Fortunately, in 2007, Tankleff was granted a pardon and released from prison. New evidence emerged that conclusively proved he was not involved in the murder of his parents. Another suspect was identified, arrested, and later convicted. Anthony Wright. The case of Anthony Wright is a shocking example of how innocent people can be wrongly convicted even when there is overwhelming evidence in their innocence. Wright was found guilty of a brutal rape and murder in Philadelphia in 1991 despite no physical evidence linking him to the crime. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The court's response to Wright's case was deeply troubling. Despite lacking physical evidence, the prosecution relied on Wright's coerced confession to secure a conviction. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the chance of parole, which would have meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Thankfully, in 2016, Wright was granted a pardon and released. His pardon was due to new DNA evidence that conclusively proved that he was not involved in the rape and murder. The DNA evidence pointed to another suspect who was arrested and convicted. Luis Vargas. Luis Vargas, living in Los Angeles, California, was charged with 3 sexual assaults. The crimes had similar descriptions, leading the police to believe they were all committed by the same person. Vargas was convicted on all counts and spent 16 years in prison. However, the California Innocence Project tested the DNA evidence and clothing from one of the victims and found that it did not match Vargas. This proved that he was innocent and did not commit the crimes he was convicted of. When Vargas was acquitted, he remained silent. His only wish, expressed to his mother, was to have a big hamburger and enjoy it together. Reportedly, after his pardon, Vargas received $886,000 in state compensation. Daniel Villegas. Daniel Villegas spent 18 years in prison for a double homicide he did not commit in El Paso, Texas. Villegas was arrested at 16, and according to reports, an El Paso detective threatened him with beatings and the death penalty if he did not confess. Under duress, Villegas signed a confession that the detectives prepared. He later withdrew his confession, but it was too late. Based solely on the false confession, he was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. During his first trial, the jury was unable to reach a verdict. In the retrial, Villegas was found guilty and received a life sentence. After spending 18 years in prison, the verdict was eventually overturned. Villegas was released on bond, got married, and started a family. In the third trial, Villegas anxiously awaited the verdict, determining whether he would go home to his family or be sent back to prison to serve his life sentence. The jury found him not guilty, leading to his freedom. Villegas is now a free man, and reportedly, he has filed a lawsuit against the city of El Paso. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching.